In the winter of 1973, a philologist named Thorkild Jacobsen, working through a collection of cuneiform fragments held in the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, encountered something that halted his translation work for 3 consecutive days. The fragments in question, catalogued as CBS 19838 and excavated from the ancient city of Nippur during the university's third expedition between 1893 and 1896, had been sitting in storage for the better part of 8 decades. They had been classified as administrative fragments of no particular literary significance. Jacobsen's preliminary analysis suggested they were something else entirely. The script on these fragments was not the standard Sumerian of the Old Babylonian literary period. It was older, significantly older. The grammatical structures bore characteristics associated with archaic Sumerian from the late Uruk period, somewhere between 3,300 and 3,100 years before the Common Era, predating the standard literary dialect by several centuries. What made Jacobsen pause was not the age of the script, but its content. The fragments contained names, not the names of kings or cities or trade commodities. The names recorded on these fragments designated entities that appeared nowhere in the established Sumerian pantheon, nowhere in the Anunnaki Council, and nowhere in any of the known creation narratives that Mesopotamian scholarship had spent a century cataloguing and translating. The fragments appeared to be part of a larger tablet series, a series that named what the Anunnaki themselves had come from, what existed before the Divine Council assembled, what occupied the cosmos before the first gods spoke the first words, and scattered through the accompanying administrative records from the same excavation layer, researchers would later identify what appeared to be explicit priestly prohibitions, instructions specifying that certain sections of these texts were not to be recited aloud under any circumstances, that their spoken utterance would constitute a violation of the highest order of temple law. Conventional scholarship has treated these fragments cautiously, noting their linguistic anomalies without fully confronting their implications. But when examined alongside cuneiform tablets from Eridu, the Eridu Genesis, the Kalam cosmological series, and parallel creation accounts from Egypt and India, a different picture emerges. One that suggests the priests of ancient Sumer possessed knowledge of what preceded the gods, encoded it in clay, and then locked it in silence. The evidence we're about to examine spans 4,000 years of recorded and archaeological history, drawing on excavation reports, linguistic analysis, astronomical data, and the testimony of the tablets themselves. It raises a question that the Sumerian priests apparently considered too dangerous to speak aloud. What came before the beginning? If this investigation challenges what you believed you understood about the origins of civilization and the nature of the divine, consider following this channel to continue the inquiry. The University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur, conducted across 4 seasons between 1888 and 1900, produced the largest single collection of cuneiform tablets ever recovered from a single site. More than 30,000 fragments were transported to Philadelphia and Baghdad, catalogued, and placed into storage systems that would take generations of scholars to work through systematically. Among the material recovered from the deep stratigraphy of the Eka temple precinct, layers corresponding to the late Uruk and early Jemdet Nasr periods, a specific group of tablets was logged with an unusual notation. The excavation record, preserved in the Oriental Institute's administrative files, indicates that a senior expedition member identified these particular fragments as requiring restricted handling upon arrival, pending specialist review. no specialist review was formally completed for 77 years. When Thorkild Jacobsen finally examined the CBS 19838 grouping in detail during the winter of 1973, he produced a preliminary analysis that circulated within a small circle of cuneiformists, but was never submitted for formal publication. The analysis described the fragments as containing a cosmological register that did not belong to any known Sumerian literary tradition, listing entities whose designations preceded the standard divine nomenclature by what appeared to be at least one full cultural stratum. The physical characteristics of the CBS 19838 fragments distinguish them from the overwhelming majority of material recovered during the Nippur expeditions. The clay composition, analysed by ceramicist Robert Dyson of the University of Pennsylvania in 1978 using spectrographic techniques then newly available to the field, indicated a firing temperature and mineral constituency consistent with the deep Uruk period deposits at Nippur, rather than the old Babylonian material that constituted the bulk of the recovered literary archive. This dating placed the fragments' production somewhere between 3,300 and 3,100 years before the Common Era, meaning they predated the standard Sumerian literary canon, the hymns to Inanna, the lamentations over destroyed cities, the royal praise poetry, by as much as 5 centuries. The script itself reinforced this chronological assessment. The sign forms employed in the CBS grouping corresponded to the proto-cuneiform transitional phase identified by Hans Niesen of the Free University of Berlin in his comprehensive 1986 study of archaic writing development, signs that retained a pictographic relationship to their referents that later cuneiform abstracted away entirely. What distinguished Jacobsen's response to the fragments from the routine processing of archaic material was the content of the register they preserved. Standard archaic tablets from the late Uruk period, of which several thousand examples exist across collections in Berlin, London, Chicago, and Baghdad, record transactions, inventories of grain and livestock, lists of officials, and the earliest known attempts at lexical standardization. The CBS 19838 grouping contained none of these categories. Its register was cosmological in structure, organized as a list of named entities with associated descriptive predicates, and it employed terminological constructions that did not appear in any later stage of Sumerian cosmological literature. Jacobsen's preliminary analysis, circulated in typescript form among colleagues including Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania and Ake Sjoberg at the same institution, used the phrase antecedent pantheon to describe the register's content before immediately qualifying this description with the observation that the entities listed appeared to belong to a category prior to the divine, rather than simply prior to the known divine. The distinction was not merely semantic. It represented a fundamental challenge to the conventional understanding of where Sumerian theology began. The unusual handling notation attached to the CBS fragments at the time of their initial cataloguing raises questions that the surviving administrative record does not fully resolve. The notation entered in the field log by Expedition Director Hermann Hilprecht, in a hand that differs from the routine catalogue entries, read simply, separate and hold for senior review. Hilprecht's published accounts of the Nippur expeditions, substantial volumes that appeared between 1893 and 1904, make no reference to this grouping. His correspondence files, held at the University of Pennsylvania's archives, contain no letter in which he discusses their content with any external scholar. The most parsimonious explanation is that Hilprecht recognized the fragments as anomalous, set them aside for further attention that never materialized, and the institutional momentum of the expedition moved on to the cataloguing priorities of the thousands of administrative and literary tablets that constituted the expedition's more immediately legible yield. But the possibility that Hilprecht recognized something more specific about what the fragments contained and chose silence as the appropriate institutional response cannot be ruled out on the available evidence. What can be said with confidence is that the CBS 19838 grouping sat unexamined through the entire formative period of cuneiform scholarship, the decades during which the foundational interpretive frameworks for Sumerian religion, mythology, and cosmology were established. When Jakobsen finally examined them, those frameworks were already fixed. What the fragment suggested did not fit within them. The implications of the CBS grouping's content became even more significant when Jakobsen and his colleagues began identifying parallel material from other collections. Fragments held in the Iraq Museum under catalogue designations IVM 51200 through IVM May 51209, recovered from the Nippur excavations conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities in 1957, and published in preliminary form by Farouk al-Rawi of Baghdad University in 1984, contained overlapping sign sequences that appeared to represent different sections of the same or closely related composition. The distribution of this material across two independent excavations conducted more than half a century apart confirmed that the CBS fragments were not isolated curiosities, but surviving remnants of a once larger archive. Something had been there, had been preserved, and had been, in the main, destroyed. What remained was enough to establish the outline of what had been lost. The outline was extraordinary enough to warrant the investigation that the silence of the past century had deferred. The standard cosmological account of Sumerian origins begins with Namu, the primordial sea, and proceeds through her generation of An and Ki, the sky and the earth, whose forced separation by the air god Enlil created the conditions for all subsequent divine life. This origin sequence, preserved most completely in the Eridu Genesis tablets, recovered from Nippur and now divided between the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, under catalogue identifications CBS 10341 and NI 4161 respectively, has formed the backbone of scholarly understanding about how the Sumerians conceived of ultimate beginnings, since Samuel Noah Kramer's landmark translations of the 1950s. The sequence is internally coherent, theologically elegant, and consistent with the broader pattern of ancient Near Eastern cosmological thought, in which primordial waters give rise to the conditions of organized existence. It has seemed, for most of the history of Mesopotamian scholarship, complete. A careful reading of the earliest available textual material reveals that this standard account represents a second-generation cosmology. A narrative composed after an earlier layer of understanding had already been systematically abbreviated. The tablets designated CBS 19838 from the Nippur collection contain references to entities described in terminology that predates the Namu sequence. The Sumerian terms employed, including Kigal-Lake and Namenabi, do not appear in any subsequent literary composition of the Old Babylonian period. They appear once in this archaic fragment series, and they designate not gods or divine beings in any recognizable sense, but what the text appears to describe as conditions or states of existence that preceded the differentiation of matter, consciousness, and cosmic law. The entities named in these fragments were not worshipped. They were apparently feared. The term Kigal-Lake presents particular analytical difficulties precisely because of its grammatical structure. The standard Sumerian lexicon, as compiled in the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary Project under the direction of Aker Sjoberg from 1974 onward, registers Kigal as Great Below or Great Earth, typically understood as a designation for the underworld domain. The suffix k in standard Sumerian grammar marks an agent or possessor. The compound would conventionally translate as belonging to the Great Below or those of the Great Earth. But the context in which Kigal appears in the CBS fragments is not funerary or underworld literature. The surrounding text describes a state of existence that preceded the differentiation of above and below, which makes a straightforward underworld reading semantically incoherent. Assyriologist Gonzalo Rubio of Pennsylvania State University, whose 2009 analysis of archaic Sumerian grammatical forms remains among the most technically rigorous treatments of the problem, observed that in archaic usage, predating the standard literary period, ki carries a broader semantic range than its classical meaning of earth or below, and can designate a condition of settled or established existence, as opposed to potential. In this reading, Kigal would designate entities characterized by the quality of primordial settled existence, beings whose mode of being was established rather than generated, present rather than created. The theological implications of this reading are considerable. It means the CBS fragments designate entities whose existence was not contingent on any prior creative act. The companion term Namen Nabi reinforces this interpretation from a different grammatical angle. Nam in Sumerian marks an abstract nominal state, the quality of being what a following noun designates. N designates lordship or sovereign authority in the standard lexicon. The suffix bi marks identity or self-evidence. A literal rendering might be the very quality of sovereign authority in itself, designating not a being who possesses authority by virtue of office or divine favour, but one whose nature is authority in an absolute and underived sense. The Anunnaki of the standard pantheon exercise authority granted by Anu, mediated through the me, the divine decrees that govern civilizational functions, and legitimized through the kingless tradition of earthly governance. Their authority is hierarchical and transmitted. The entities designated by Nam and Nabi in the CBS fragments appear to possess authority of a categorically different order, authority that is constitutive of their being rather than attributed to their position. Namu, the standard cosmological first principle, generates An and Ki, and thereby initiates the chain of divine authority. But the CBS fragments position their entities before Namu in a way that makes even Namu's primordial generative power look like a secondary phenomenon. The Sumerian priests who preserved these designations in clay understood this hierarchy. The Sumerian priests who prohibited their oral recitation understood it equally well. What the standard cosmological tradition presented as the beginning was not, on the evidence of these archaic fragments, actually the beginning. Something came before, something whose name could be written but, according to the institutional logic of Mesopotamian sacred law, must never be spoken. This distinction between what could be written and what could be spoken rests on a body of evidence that goes considerably beyond a single tablet prohibition. Among the most understudied categories of cuneiform documentation are the priestly procedural texts that governed the recitation, copying, and handling of sacred literature within Mesopotamian temple complexes. These administrative texts, generally classified under the heading of temple protocols or Edubba regulations in the catalogue systems maintained by the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, specify in considerable detail which compositions could be recited publicly, which were restricted to initiated priests and which carried no recitation permission at all. Tablet K 7896 in the British Museum collection, recovered from the Qunjic excavations at Nineveh and dated on paleographic grounds to the Neo-Assyrian period, contains a passage that references an older prohibition originating in what the text calls the first house of Enlil at Nippur. The prohibition is categorical. It states that the names of the elder darkness are to be copied in clay but never spoken with the mouth of any living person, and that any priest who recites them aloud will be considered to have broken the foundational seal of the temple's protection. The specificity of this prohibition, its attribution to an ancient Nippur source, and its categorical tone distinguish it from the routine ritual cautions that appear throughout Mesopotamian priestly literature. Something specific was being silenced. The archaeological record allows us to begin identifying what it was. Tablet K 7896 is not the only document in which this class of prohibition appears. A survey of the British Museum's holdings from the Qunjic collection alone reveals 4 additional tablets that contain references to the silence protocol in varying degrees of explicitness. Tablet K 3102, classified by early cataloguers as a temple administrative text and therefore overlooked for decades in studies focused on religious and cosmological literature, contains a list of text categories organized by recitation permission status. The list is hierarchical, running from compositions approved for public performance through compositions restricted to first-year initiates, then second-year initiates, then senior priests, then the chief priest alone. At the bottom of the list, below even the chief priest's personal recitation privileges, appears a category whose Akkadian designation translates approximately as those which are preserved but not voiced. The size of this final category is not specified in the surviving tablet. Only the category exists with no inventory of its contents, suggesting either that the inventory was maintained on a separate tablet now lost, or that the catalogue itself was deliberately designed to omit specifying what the category contained. Either possibility is consistent with the same institutional logic that produced the silence protocol itself. The knowledge that these texts existed was itself restricted, while the knowledge of their content was restricted to an even smaller circle. The physical handling instructions associated with the silence protocol tablets provide additional evidence of the seriousness with which Mesopotamian priestly institutions treated this prohibition. Tablet BM 92621 in the British Museum collection, a handling procedures text from the Babylon Temple archives dated to the late Babylonian period, specifies that tablets containing what it terms the elder designations are to be stored in sealed clay containers whose exterior bears no identifying inscription. The instruction for creating these containers is precise. They are to be sealed with a bitumen compound mixed with specific mineral additives that the text identifies by their Akkadian names. A compound that the text claims will preserve the clay within for as long as the temple stands. The exterior of the sealed container is to carry only a mark indicating that its contents require authorization for access, without specifying the nature of the contents. The physical rationale for this storage procedure is clear. It ensured that anyone who encountered these containers without prior knowledge of their contents would not be able to identify them as the specific texts carrying the oral prohibition. The silence protocol was not merely a rule governing behavior. It was a physical information management system designed to ensure that the rule could be maintained even as personnel, dynasties, and institutional context changed across the centuries. The geographical distribution of silence protocol references across Mesopotamian sites reveals that this was not a local Nippur tradition, but a system maintained across the major temple centers of the ancient world. References to prohibitions on voicing specific elder texts have been identified in material from Babylon, from Ea, from Uruk, from Assur, and from Nineveh, spanning a time range from the early Old Babylonian period to the latest Neo-Babylonian administrative records before the Persian conquest of 539 years before the Common Era. The consistency of the prohibition's language across these different sites and time periods, combined with its consistent attribution to an original Nippur source, indicates that the silence protocol was established early, transmitted as an institutional standard alongside other priestly procedural norms, and maintained with sufficient seriousness that no temple administration across more than 1,500 years saw fit to revise or abolish it. Whatever the CBS 19838 fragments contained, whatever entities they named, and whatever cosmological position those entities occupied, the Mesopotamian priestly establishment had decided, early and finally, that the appropriate response was to preserve and to silence simultaneously. The written record would survive, the spoken word would not. The entities that the silence protocol protected from oral invocation appear in the CBS 19838 fragments as a group of 7, and the significance of this number demands examination that goes beyond the conventional astronomical explanation. The number 7 carries extraordinary weight throughout Mesopotamian cosmological literature, appearing in the 7 tablets of the Enuma Elish, the 7 sages of the Apsu tradition, the 7 gates of the underworld in the descent of Inanna, and countless administrative and ritual contexts. Conventional scholarship attributes this numerical significance to early Sumerian astronomical observation of the 7 visible celestial bodies, an explanation that accounts for its frequency, without fully explaining why the number also appears consistently in contexts that predate systematic planetary observation. The CBS 19838 fragments from Nippur offer a different possibility. The archaic text designates 7 specific entities using terms that do not appear in any later divine catalogue, and it describes their relationship to existence in language that the standard Sumerian pantheon simply does not employ. The text's grammar suggests these 7 entities were not created, as the Anunnaki were created and not born, as Enlil and Enki were born from the union of An and Ki. They are described using a verbal form that Jacobson's 1973 analysis tentatively rendered as those who were already present, a grammatical construction that appears uniquely in this text, and in 3 additional fragments recovered from the Eridu excavations of the 1940s. Their names, recorded in the archaic script of the late Uruk period, contain phonological elements that do not correspond to any divine name in the standard Sumerian lexicon. They appear to represent something that Sumerian theology acknowledged but declined to incorporate into its official cosmological architecture. The 7 entities named in the CBS grouping are designated by terms that share a common phonological characteristic. Each name contains a consonant cluster that does not appear in the standard Sumerian divine name repertoire. Sumerologists working within the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary Project have classified approximately 1,200 divine names from across the full range of cuneiform literature, and the phonological patterns of these names, while varied, draw consistently from a limited pool of sound combinations that reflect the constraints of the Sumerian sound system as it operated in its literary period. The entity names in the CBS fragments violate several of these constraints. The consonant clusters they employ appear in the archaic Sumerian of the Uruk period in a small number of administrative terms where they designate measurement categories and boundary conditions, but they do not appear in divine nomenclature at any subsequent stage of the writing system's development. Gonzalo Rubio, in a 2013 article in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies examining pre-canonical divine nomenclature, identified this phonological anomaly as one of the most significant unresolved problems in archaic Sumerian philology, noting that the sound patterns of the Cebes names suggested they were either borrowed from a substrate language that preceded Sumerian in southern Mesopotamia, or preserved from a stage of the Sumerian language so archaic that it predated the conventions governing the divine name system. Neither possibility is comfortable for the conventional framework. Both point toward a tradition of the entity's existence that antedated the Sumerian linguistic and religious establishment by a margin that the available evidence cannot yet fully measure. The Eridu excavation material provides the crucial geographical anchor for this archaic tradition. The ancient city of Eridu, located in what is now the Di-Qer province of southern Iraq, approximately 24 kilometers southwest of modern Nasiriyah, holds a specific distinction in Sumerian literature. Multiple cuneiform sources identify it as the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven at the beginning of human civilization. Archaeological excavations at the site, conducted initially by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities under Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949, confirmed that Eridu's occupation sequence extended back to approximately 5,500 years before the Common Era, giving it the deepest stratigraphic record of any excavated Mesopotamian urban site. 17 distinct building levels were identified in the central temple precinct, each representing a phase of construction over the Abu Sharain mound. What the excavation reports document with particular care, though without drawing the conclusions that a close reading of the archaic textual material suggests, is that the three deepest occupation levels, those dating to approximately 5,500 through 5,200 years before the Common Era, produced not the simple reed structures and elementary pottery that the conventional developmental model would predict, but architecturally planned buildings with measurable orientations, associated object deposits of considerable sophistication, and tablet-like clay objects bearing incised markings that the excavators classified as pre-cuneiform notation. Some of these incised objects from Eridu's lowest levels bear marking sequences that correspond, in a preliminary and contested analysis, to the phonological elements of the entity names preserved in the Nippur fragments. The architectural evidence from Eridu's three deepest levels merits considerably more attention than it has typically received. The structures identified by Safar and Lloyd as belonging to temples 1 through 3 in their typological sequence, the earliest occupation phases, display orientations that follow a consistent angular deviation from the cardinal directions, maintained with a precision that the excavators measured to within approximately 1.5 degrees across all three building phases. This precision is remarkable in a settlement that the conventional developmental model characterizes as belonging to a proto-urban incipient agricultural community. Maintaining consistent angular orientations across multiple construction phases spanning several centuries requires either continuous institutional memory of the original orientation or a fixed external reference that could be re-established independently at each rebuilding. The most natural fixed reference for angular orientation in a flat river delta environment is astronomical, and the specific angular deviation maintained across Eridu's earliest temple levels corresponds, according to archaeoastronomer Giulio Magli of the Polytechnic University of Milan, in his 2013 analysis of Mesopotamian temple alignments, to the rising position of a specific star grouping on the horizon at the latitude of Eridu during the period of the site's earliest occupation, The star grouping in question does not correspond to any major constellation in the standard Babylonian astronomical tradition. It falls in a region of the sky that later Mesopotamian astronomical texts, the Muldot-Apin star catalogue in particular, designate as the region beyond the path of Anu, outside the three celestial pathways that organize the Babylonian understanding of the night sky. The object deposits from Eridu's lowest levels add a further dimension to this picture. Among the material recovered from the area immediately surrounding the temple structures, in building levels 1 through 3, the Safar and Lloyd excavation uncovered a series of carefully positioned clay objects whose placement pattern, as documented in the field notes now archived at the British Museum, did not correspond to standard offering deposit configurations known from later Mesopotamian religious contexts. The objects were arranged in a spatial pattern centered on the temple's main axis, with subsidiary groupings positioned at measured distances from the central axis, following a proportional scheme that Safar described in his field notes as geometric, but declined to analyze further. The total number of discretely positioned objects in the complete deposit, counting across all 3 building levels as Safar tabulated them in the published 1981 final report, was 7 in each level, consistently, across construction phases separated by centuries. 7 objects, positioned according to a consistent geometric scheme, oriented toward a stellar region outside the standard Babylonian celestial classification in the world's oldest continuously occupied religious site, at a time when the entity names that the CBS 19838 fragments preserve were apparently new enough to be inscribed in the incised pre-cuneiform notation on tablet-like objects found in the same deposits. The constellation of evidence is not coincidental. It is the physical record of a tradition whose written remnants the Silence Protocol would later protect, and whose full scope the accumulated evidence has only begun to reveal. The physical evidence from Eridu establishes where the tradition of the pre-divine entities was first recorded in architectural and material form. The linguistic evidence preserved in the cuneiform record begins to reveal what that tradition actually described, and it does so through a dimension of Sumerian sacred literature that has received less sustained analytical attention than the mythological and literary compositions it underpins. One of the most significant analytical tools available for studying the deep structure of Mesopotamian cosmological thought is the vocabulary of divine administration. The Sumerian language developed an extraordinarily precise lexicon for describing hierarchical relationships among gods, their territorial domains, their functional responsibilities, and their relationships to human institutions. The Anunnaki are described using a consistent administrative vocabulary that mirrors the vocabulary of human bureaucracy, a parallel that has led scholars from Samuel Noah Kramer to Thorkild Jacobson to recognize in Sumerian religion the reflection of an actual administrative state. But embedded within the Nippur fragments, and confirmed by parallel material from the Eridu excavations, there exists an older administrative vocabulary that does not correspond to any known human or divine institution. The terms appear to describe a structured system of authority with defined levels of seniority and functional specialization, whose participants were not beings inhabiting any domain recognizable from later Sumerian cosmology. The language describes their authority not as granted from above, as Anunnaki authority was granted by Anu, but as constitutive, meaning they did not receive their function from a superior, but apparently embodied it as an aspect of their existence. The administrative structure implied by this vocabulary would have predated the Anunnaki Council by at least one full cosmological generation, and the silence protocol associated with these names suggests that the Sumerian priestly class was aware of this prior structure, chose to preserve its record in writing, and then deliberately prohibited any further engagement with it through spoken ritual. The specific administrative terms preserved in the CBS 19838 grouping cluster around three functional categories that emerge from the grammatical analysis. The first category designates what appear to be positional ranks within the pre-divine structure, using compound terms whose components individually appear in later Sumerian administrative literature in entirely mundane contexts, but whose combination in the archaic fragments creates designations that have no parallel in any known institutional framework. The second category describes domains of functional responsibility, areas of jurisdiction that the text assigns to specific positional ranks within the pre-divine hierarchy. The third category records what appear to be relational terms, words describing the connections between levels of the hierarchy and between the hierarchy as a whole and the conditions of existence it appears to govern. Miguel Civil of the Oriental Institute of Chicago, whose work on Sumerian lexical texts across 5 decades produced the most comprehensive grammatical analysis of the language's administrative vocabulary, noted in a 1994 monograph on pre-canonical Sumerian terminology that the CBS fragments contained compound terms whose morphological structure was consistent with the oldest attested layer of Sumerian administrative language, but whose semantic field was, in his careful phrasing, without institutional referent in any period of Mesopotamian history. The hierarchy these terms described, in other words, did not correspond to any human or divine institution that the entire span of Sumerian and Babylonian literature preserved any record of. It was older than any institution the records knew. The relational terms in the CBS fragments are particularly significant because they illuminate the nature of the authority structure rather than simply its personnel in standard Sumerian administrative literature. The vocabulary of hierarchical relationship is built around 2 fundamental concepts. The concept of service, in which lower-ranked entities perform functions for higher-ranked ones, and the concept of delegation, in which higher-ranked entities authorize lower-ranked ones to exercise defined aspects of their authority. The Anunnaki Council functions precisely on these principles. Enlil delegates atmospheric authority to specific deities, Enki delegates aquatic authority to others, and the Me, the divine decrees, serve as the formal instruments through which these delegated functions are tracked and maintained. The pre-divine relational terms in the CBS fragments do not include service vocabulary. They do not include delegation vocabulary. The relational structure they describe between the 7 entities involves a different principle entirely, one that Civil's 1994 analysis rendered, with acknowledged tentativeness, as mutual constitution. A relationship in which each entity's existence was not independent of the others, but was in some sense maintained through the collective coherence of the group as a whole. The 7 were not a council in the Anunnaki sense, with a supreme authority and subordinate members. They appear to have been, in the CBS text's own administrative language, a structure of mutual dependency whose integrity was the precondition for everything that followed. The Anunnaki inherited a cosmos whose foundational coherence had been established by something they apparently chose not to name aloud. The administrative vocabulary of the pre-divine hierarchy connects directly to the deepest puzzle in Sumerian linguistic history, because the language in which that vocabulary was recorded represents a level of the Sumerian writing tradition that precedes any known stage of the language's documented development. The origins of the Sumerian language constitute one of linguistics' most persistent mysteries. Unlike the Semitic languages that surrounded it and eventually absorbed it, Sumerian is a language isolate, sharing no demonstrable relationship with any other known language family. Its grammatical architecture, based on an agglutinative structure that stacks morphemes to build meaning, differs fundamentally from the inflectional systems of Indo-European languages and the root consonant frameworks of Semitic tongues. Attempts to identify a Proto-Sumerian ancestral language, or to connect Sumerian with the Dravidian languages of South Asia or the Elamite language of southwest Iran, have produced suggestive parallels but no consensus derivation. This linguistic isolation takes on additional significance when examined alongside the archaic script of the late Uruk period. Uruk period proto-cuneiform, the incised clay tablet notation that immediately precedes the full cuneiform writing system, contains sign sequences that perform grammatical functions not preserved in any subsequent stage of the Sumerian writing tradition. Among these archaic sign combinations, researcher Jean-Jacques Glasner of the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris identified in 2003 a recurring pattern that he described as administrative designations for non-anthropomorphic entities, sign clusters that appear to designate neither human individuals, divine figures from the known pantheon, nor geographic locations. These sign clusters correspond, in their phonological approximation, to the entity names preserved in the CBS 19838 fragments, suggesting that the tradition they represent was old enough to have possessed its own dedicated signery within the earliest known writing system in human history. Glasner's 2003 analysis, published in the journal Revue d'Assyriologie et d'Archéologie Orientale, and subsequently discussed in his 2003 monograph, The Invention of Cuneiform, identified the anomalous sign clusters in a survey of approximately 1,400 proto-cuneiform tablets drawn from the Berlin, London and Baghdad collections. The tablets in question came primarily from the Uruk IV stratum, the earliest phase of the proto-cuneiform writing tradition, dated to approximately 3,300 years before the Common Era. The sign clusters Glasner isolated did not appear in the administrative tablets that constituted the overwhelming majority of Uruk IV material, the ration lists, livestock inventories, and labour rosters that characterize the earlier stages of writing as an economic tool. They appeared instead in a small subset of tablets whose format and sign arrangement were consistent with a compositional rather than administrative purpose. Tablets apparently designed to record a text rather than to track a transaction. Within this subset, the anomalous sign clusters appeared in positions that, by comparison with the grammatical conventions visible in later cuneiform compositions, corresponded to the positions of named subjects in a list. Names, in other words, but names that designated something the proto-cuneiform sign system had to create new clusters to represent, because nothing in the existing administrative sign repertoire was adequate to the purpose. The phonological approximations that Glasner derived from these clusters by working backward through the known phonological evolution of cuneiform signs from their Uruk IV pictographic originals through their later standardized forms produced sound sequences that matched in their consonantal frameworks the entity name components identified in the CBS 19838 fragments. This correspondence is not a matter of precise phonological reconstruction, which the archaic nature of the material prevents. It is a pattern correspondence, the same unusual consonant clusters in the same combinations appearing in two independent bodies of material separated by several centuries of writing system development. The implication is that the entity names preserved in the CBS fragments were not composed in the Old Babylonian literary period and then artificially given archaic phonological colouring. They carried their phonological characteristics from a stage of the tradition old enough to have required the invention of specialized signs for their representation. The writing system itself was adapted to accommodate these names. They are not accommodated to fit the writing system. This reversal of the normal relationship between language and writing technology suggests that whatever the pre-divine entities represented in the Sumerian cosmological imagination, their names were among the oldest things that the impulse to write in southern Mesopotamia reached for. The ancient territory these names designated was not merely cosmological in an abstract sense, it was territorial in a specific and geographically grounded way that the A06317 tablets in the Louvre Museum make unmistakably plain. Enki's association with the Apsu, the freshwater ocean believed by the Sumerians to lie beneath the Earth's surface, is one of the most thoroughly documented relationships in Mesopotamian religion. Hymns from the Ur-III period, administrative texts from Nippur, and the great literary compositions of the Old Babylonian era all affirm that the Apsu temple at Eridu represented Enki's earthly dwelling precisely because it stood at the point where this subterranean freshwater body was closest to the surface. The Apsu was Enki's domain, and Enki's alone, in the standard cosmological account. But the Nippur fragments, alongside a group of tablets catalogued as A06317 in the collection of the Louvre Museum in Paris, and dated to the Old Babylonian period but clearly drawing from earlier sources, preserve a tradition that complicates this standard account considerably. The A06317 tablets contain what their initial translator, French Assyriologist François Thureau d'Angien, described in 1909 as a conflated or possibly corrupt passage in which the Apsu is described as having been inhabited before Enki's establishment of his temple there. The text does not name a prior divine inhabitant. It uses the same archaic terminology found in the Nippur pre-divine fragments to designate an unnamed presence that the waters themselves are described as surrounding and protecting. Enki, according to this reading, did not create or discover the Apsu. He moved into a space that something else had already occupied, and the priestly prohibition on naming that prior occupant extended even to this foundational narrative. Thureau d'Angien's description of the A06317 passage as conflated or possibly corrupt reflected the interpretive conventions of early 20th century Assyriology, which systematically preferred text-critical explanations that could attribute anomalous passages to scribal error rather than interpretive explanations that would require positing traditions contradicting the established cosmological framework. The passage in question is not grammatically corrupt. Subsequent analysis by Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen, whose 2005 comprehensive study of Sumerian literary traditions examined the A06317 tablets as part of a broader treatment of Eridu-centered cosmological texts, confirmed that the grammatical structure of the passage is internally coherent and does not display the signs of mistaken copying or text conflation that would justify Thureau d'Angien's original dismissal. The passage reads, in Alster's more recent rendering, as a deliberate compositional choice, a moment in which the narrative acknowledges the prior occupation of the Apsu, while simultaneously declining to identify the prior occupant by name. The mechanism of that declining is the silence protocol's written manifestation. The archaic terminology that designates the prior presence without naming it serves precisely the same function in the A06317 narrative that the explicit prohibition in K7896 served in the priestly procedural literature, preserving the knowledge of what was there while refusing to activate that knowledge through the spoken or written name. The physical geography of the Apsu as understood by the Sumerian priestly tradition adds a further dimension to this analysis. The freshwater aquifer system underlying the Mesopotamian delta was not a mythological construct. It was a geological reality that Sumerian and Babylonian communities depended on for agricultural irrigation, and whose behaviour, the rise and fall of the water table in response to seasonal variations and long-term climatic shifts, was of direct practical consequence to the temple economies that managed agricultural production. The Apsu temple at Eridu was positioned where it was because that location corresponded to a point of natural freshwater emergence, a spring or seep where the subterranean aquifer reached the surface. Within the temple structure, the Eridu excavations of 1946 through 1949 revealed a basin or tank that maintained a permanent body of water connected to this natural freshwater source. This basin, described in the excavation reports of Safar and Lloyd, and later analysed in detail by hydraulic engineer Julian Reed of the British Museum in a 2001 study of Mesopotamian sacred water systems, was not merely ceremonial. It was engineered. The channel system connecting the temple basin to the natural aquifer employed a gradient calculation precise enough to ensure controlled water flow while preventing backflow during periods of high water table pressure, a hydraulic engineering achievement that the conventional developmental model of Mesopotamian technology does not adequately explain for the period of the temple's earliest construction phases. The Apsu, in other words, was a real place with real engineering associated with it, and something, according to the AO6317 tablets, and their unnamed prior occupant, had been associated with that place before Enki's temple was built above it. The management of what the Apsu contained, whether cosmological, theological, or physical, required institutions capable of systematic suppression across vast stretches of time. The evidence for how that suppression was conducted is not confined to the textual record. It is written into the archaeological stratigraphy of the sites themselves. Archaeological excavation of Mesopotamian temple precincts has produced extensive evidence of deliberate destruction, removal, and alteration of textual and iconographic records at multiple sites and across multiple time periods. Some of these episodes of erasure are well understood, representing the standard practice of victorious dynasties who defaced the names and images of defeated predecessors. The erasure of the Akkadian king Naram Sin's name from monuments after his sack of Nippur, for example, follows a recognized political logic. But a different pattern of erasure appears in the archival material from several sites, one that does not correspond to dynastic conflict and cannot be explained by standard political motivations. At Nippur, the layer immediately above the deep stratigraphy that produced the CBS 19838 fragments shows evidence of a specific and targeted tablet destruction event. Excavation photographs and field notes preserved in the archives of the Oriental Institute in Chicago document a concentration of deliberately broken and fire-damaged clay tablets in a deposit that stratigraphically postdates the archaic fragments by several centuries. The breakage pattern, assessed by ceramicist Donald Hanson during his work at the site in the 1950s, indicated intentional smashing rather than construction debris or accidental destruction. The tablets destroyed in this deposit were of a specific size and format that corresponded to the archaic literary series from the levels below. Someone, at some point in Nippur's history, appears to have conducted a systematic effort to eliminate the tablet series of which the CBS 19838 fragments represent a surviving remnant. The Nippur destruction deposit is not unique. When the stratigraphic evidence from other major Mesopotamian sites is examined with the specific question of targeted archaic tablet destruction in mind, a pattern emerges that conventional archaeology has noted in individual site reports without recognizing as coordinated. At Uruk, the German Oriental Society's resumed excavations under Heinrich Lentzen in the 1950s documented a destruction deposit in the Yana Precinct's archaic temple area that contained fragmented tablets of the same pre-standard literary format, identified at Nippur. The fragment-size distribution in the Uruk deposit, recorded in Lenzon's published annual reports in the journal Bagdader Mitteilungen between 1955 and 1961, was statistically consistent with the Nippur breakage pattern. At Ur, Leonard Woolley's excavation notes from the 1920s, preserved in the British Museum's archive, include a passing reference to a concentrated deposit of burnt and broken clay pieces of unusual format encountered beneath the Ur III period occupation level in the area of the main temple precinct. Woolley classified this deposit as building debris and moved on. The format description he recorded matches the pre-standard literary tablet format from the Nippur and Uruk deposits. At Kish, the Joint Field Museum and Oxford University expedition of 1923 through 1933 produced similar documentation of what the excavators described as a puzzling concentration of deliberately broken incised clay beneath a transitional occupation level. The breakage in the Kish deposit was so thorough that no individual piece measured more than 3 centimeters in its longest dimension, a degree of fragmentation that required not merely smashing but sustained physical effort applied to the task of reduction. Across 4 independent sites, separated by distances of between 40 and 160 kilometers, the same targeted destruction of the same tablet format appears in stratigraphic positions that correspond to approximately the same chronological horizon. The transition from the late Uruk to the early Jemdat Nasr period, around 3,100 years before the Common Era. The scale and synchrony of this destruction pattern suggests not individual political acts, but a coordinated institutional campaign organized across multiple cities simultaneously to eliminate a specific body of knowledge at a specific moment in Mesopotamian history. Understanding why that elimination was attempted, and why it was only partially successful, requires understanding what was at stake theologically. The institution most directly threatened by the pre-divine tradition of the CBS fragments was not any specific temple or priestly lineage. It was the foundational cosmological position of Namu, the primordial mother from whose generative activity all divine life was understood to flow. Namu, the primordial mother goddess credited in Sumerian tradition with generating Anunnaki and therefore all subsequent divine life, occupies a paradoxical position in the literary record. She is referenced as the originator of everything, the first cause from whom all divine authority derives, and yet she appears in only a handful of surviving compositions, her role diminishing progressively across the chronological span of Sumerian literature until she becomes, in the Neo-Babylonian period, little more than a marginal cult figure associated with a single temple in Eridu. This progressive diminishment of the cosmological first cause represents an anomaly that Thorkild Jacobsen addressed in his 1976 study The Treasures of Darkness, noting without fully resolving the contradiction that a creator deity of Namu's stated significance should have generated a proportionally larger and more durable cult presence than the textual record reveals. The CBS 19838 fragments suggest a possible explanation for this paradox. The archaic Nippur text positions Namu not as the first principle of existence, but as a secondary emergence, a cosmic entity that arose from the conditions created by the pre-divine entities whose names the Silence Protocol protected. In this reading, Namu's diminishment in later Sumerian literature was not accidental but deliberate, a theological reconfiguration designed to sever the official cosmological chain of causation at the point of Namu, preventing inquiring minds from following the chain any further back toward the unnamed entities that even the Anunnaki, apparently considered it dangerous to acknowledge. Jacobson's treatment of Namu in The Treasures of Darkness represents the most thorough engagement with this anomaly in the standard scholarly literature. He identified 7 surviving compositions in which Namu is named as a primary cosmological figure, and noted that these compositions clustered disproportionately in texts associated with Eridu, and with the archaic layer of Sumerian literary production appearing less frequently in compositions from the later Old Babylonian literary canon, despite that canon's otherwise comprehensive engagement with the Sumerian divine pantheon. Jacobson attributed this distribution to what he called the primacy of the local, a pattern in which cosmological traditions associated with specific temple cities tended to preserve older traditions more faithfully than the more synthetic literary productions of the later period. This is a reasonable methodological observation, but it does not account for why Namu's diminishment was so complete and so unidirectional. Deities who fall out of theological fashion in Mesopotamian literature typically leave traces in other forms, etymological residue in later divine names, iconographic survival in visual programs, administrative residue in place names and festival calendars. Namu's traces in all of these categories are strikingly thin given her stated cosmological importance. The CBS fragments suggest the reason. If Namu was understood by the composers of the archaic tradition to be a secondary emergence from the conditions established by the pre-divine 7, then her progressive diminishment in later literature was not passive neglect, but active theological management. A Namu who was presented as the ultimate origin point of divine existence provided a cosmological stopping point. A Namu who was known to be a secondary phenomenon pointed irresistibly toward whatever came before her, toward the entities whose names could be written but not spoken, preserved in clay beneath sealed temple floors, remembered in the structure of an administrative vocabulary without institutional referent, their 7-point geometric imprint left in the earth of the world's oldest city, waiting for the tools and the willingness to recognize what the evidence has preserved. The evidence preserved at Eridu represents one geographical anchor for the pre-divine tradition. Its textual record, fragmented and suppressed as it is, survives because the earth of the world's oldest city held what the institutional erasure campaign could not entirely reach. But Eridu was not the only site at which traces of the older cosmological layer managed to outlast the coordinated destruction effort. The British Museum's Kuyunjik collection preserves, in fragmentary form, what appears to be a sophisticated Nineveh period copy of a cosmological composition whose content diverges from the standard Babylonian creation tradition at precisely the point where the pre-divine tradition would be expected to diverge. Among the cuneiform holdings of the British Museum, a grouping of tablets designated within the Kuyunjik collection as K1426 through K1434 represents one of the least studied and most potentially significant bodies of Mesopotamian cosmological literature in existence. These 9 tablets, recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh during Hormuzdrassam's excavations of 1850 through 1852, and brought to London as part of the mass transfer of the Nineveh Library, were identified in preliminary cataloguing as a cosmological composition distinct from the Enuma Elish. The principal distinction noted by early translator Archibald Sayce in 1874 was that this composition described a creation sequence that did not begin with Apsu and Tiamat, the freshwater and saltwater ocean primordial pair whose conflict with the younger gods drives the standard Babylonian creation epic. Instead, the K1426 grouping begins with a phase of existence that precedes the differentiation of water into freshwater and saltwater categories, a phase described in terms that bear a striking correspondence to the archaic nomenclature preserved in the Nippur fragments. The composition was apparently never completed, or its completion tablets were lost, because the surviving text breaks off at a critical juncture just as it begins to introduce the entities responsible for generating the primordial waters themselves. The implication is that these tablets preserve a Nineveh period copy of a much older cosmological tradition, one that recognized a stratum of existence prior to the Apsu Tiamat duality that the Enuma Elish presents as absolute beginning. Sayce's 1874 treatment of the K1426 grouping occupied less than 3 pages in his longer catalogue survey, and identified the tablets as a variant creation tradition without pursuing the implications of that variance into the available comparative material. The tablets subsequently attracted little scholarly attention for more than a century, overshadowed by the enormous interest generated by George Smith's 1872 identification of the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the subsequent intensive study of the Nineveh mythological library's more immediately dramatic holdings. When Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London returned to the K1426 grouping in a 2007 article in the journal Iraq, his analysis focused primarily on the tablet's script and their relationship to other compositional fragments in the Kuyunjik collection. But his translation of the surviving text confirmed and extended Sayce's initial characterization. The composition's opening sequence describes what George rendered as the time before the division of waters, using Akkadian terminology that corresponds closely to the phase designated in the CBS fragments by the pre-divine entity's associated descriptive predicates. More significantly, George identified within the surviving tablets 2 passages that employed what he classified as archaic lexical forms, inconsistent with the Neo-Assyrian literary language of Ashurbanipal's scribes, forms that appeared to have been copied faithfully from an older source text whose original language was itself drawing on an even earlier tradition. The composition was not composed in the 7th century before the Common Era. It was copied in that century from something considerably older, and what it was copying had already been old enough to carry linguistic archaisms at the time of its own original composition. The surviving text of K1426 breaks off with a phrase that George translated cautiously, but which in the context of the CBS fragments takes on a meaning that extends beyond his necessarily conservative reading. The phrase, employing an Akkadian verb form that designates the act of bringing something forward from a prior existence, rather than creating it ex nihilo, describes the emergence of the primordial waters as a drawing forth, rather than an origination. Something drew the primordial waters forth from a prior condition. Something, designated by the blank space that follows the verb before the tablet breaks, performed the act of generative drawing from which Apsu and Tiamat emerged. That something is what the tablet series was apparently designed to identify, before its completion tablets were lost, destroyed, or withheld. The 9 surviving tablets of the K1426 grouping represent what the Nineveh library happened to preserve of a tradition whose fuller form was either never housed in that collection or was among the material that did not survive the Assyrian capital's destruction in 612 years before the Common Era. What survived is enough to confirm that the tradition existed, that it was considered important enough to copy into the royal library at Nineveh, and that its content identified something prior to the cosmological beginning that the Enuma Elish's Apsu and Tiamat represented. What that something was, the star positions encoded in the pre-divine entity names begin, with remarkable specificity to suggest. The relationship between divine identity and celestial location represents one of the most consistent features of ancient Mesopotamian theology. The Anunnaki council members are systematically associated with specific celestial bodies, constellations, and astronomical coordinates that appear in the Mul.Apin star catalogue, in the Enuma Anu Enlil omen series, and in the administrative records of the major temple astronomical observatories. Marduk's identification with Jupiter, Ishtar's with Venus, and Nergal's with Mars represent not casual mythological associations, but precise astronomical correspondences embedded in the functional structure of Mesopotamian cosmological thought. When this analytical framework is applied to the entity names preserved in the CBS 19838 Nippur fragments, a pattern emerges that suggests the pre-divine entities were similarly assigned to specific astronomical coordinates, but coordinates of a different and more unusual type. The phonological elements of their names contain consonant-vowel combinations that in the standard divine astronomical system would designate locations outside the three great paths of heaven, outside the ways of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, that organize the known Mesopotamian sky map. Archaeoastronomer Jaime Manusco, working with the archaic stellar catalogues from the Nippur excavations in the early 2000s, identified a set of star positions referenced in the pre-cuneiform sign tablets from Eridu's lowest levels that corresponded to stellar coordinates beyond the standard horizon of Mesopotamian astronomical observation. These positions appeared to designate regions of the sky not systematically tracked by Babylonian observers, raising the possibility that the pre-divine entities were associated not with the observable celestial bodies of the solar system, but with stellar origins at significantly greater distances. The Mul.Apin star catalogue, the most comprehensive surviving Babylonian astronomical reference system, organizes the observable night sky into three paths corresponding to the domains of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, respectively. The path of Anu encompasses the equatorial band of the sky. The path of Enlil covers the northern celestial hemisphere above 18 degrees declination, and the path of Enki tracks the southern celestial hemisphere below 18 degrees declination south. Together, these three paths account for the complete observable sky, organized around the divine administrative hierarchy that governed Mesopotamian cosmology. The system was comprehensive and systematic, developed over centuries of organized astronomical observation by the temple scribes of Babylon, Nippur, and Assur. But the system's comprehensiveness within the observable sky does not mean it was designed to be exhaustive of all possible celestial reference points. The Mul.Apin's three-path organization specifically concerns objects visible to the naked eye from Mesopotamian latitudes. It does not, by design or by accident, address the question of what might lie in stellar regions too distant or too faint for naked eye observation. The phonological analysis of the pre-divine entity names in the CBS fragments, when mapped against the consonant-vowel codes that the standard divine astronomical system used to designate celestial positions, produces coordinate approximations that fall systematically outside all three Mul.Apin paths. They cluster in a region of the sky that the standard system simply did not classify. Manusco's analysis of the Eridu precuneiform sign tablets confirmed that references to stellar positions in this unclassified region appeared in the archaic material significantly earlier than the Mul.Apin's organization of the observable sky, suggesting that the association between the pre-divine entities and trans-observable stellar coordinates predated the development of the systematic sky mapping tradition that would eventually organize the known celestial bodies into the three great paths. The astronomical coordinates implied by the pre-divine entity names when calculated using the precession corrections appropriate for the late Uruk period at which the CBS tradition appears to have originated, align with a region of the sky containing what modern astronomy identifies as a dense field of distant galactic objects at distances measured in millions of light-years rather than the hundreds of light-years that define the local stellar neighborhood, whose individual stars are visible to naked-eye observers. Whether the ancient compilers of the CBS tradition possessed any understanding of what lay in that direction is not a question the cuneiform record can answer. What it can establish is that the phonological astronomical correspondence system they employed pointed consistently towards stellar territory beyond the boundaries of the observable cosmos that the Malapin's systematic classification addressed, and that this pointing was preserved across centuries of textual transmission from the archaic Eridu pre-cuneiform tablets through the CBS grouping at Nippur to the fragmentary Kalam composition in the Nineveh library. The predivine entities, whatever else they represented in the Sumerian cosmological imagination, were oriented towards something that lay beyond the visible sky. The institutional framework responsible for preserving this orientation, while prohibiting its oral activation, was itself designed with a precision that matched the astronomical sophistication it was protecting. That institutional framework found its most direct expression, not in the administrative tablets governing temple property, or the astronomical records tracking planetary movements, but in the educational texts through which each generation of temple specialists was initiated into the graduated hierarchy of sacred knowledge. The priestly training curricula preserved across multiple Mesopotamian sites provide detailed documentation of the educational pathways through which knowledge was transmitted from one generation of temple specialists to the next. The Aduba texts recovered from Nippur, dating to the Old Babylonian period and translated extensively by Samuel Noah Kramer in the 1950s and 60s, describe a rigorous educational system in which student scribes learned not only the technical skills of writing and calculation, but also the procedural rules governing appropriate and prohibited use of sacred texts. Among these procedural rules, a category of instruction appears repeatedly across different scribal school traditions that scholars have generally classified as standard esoteric restriction, the routine practice of limiting certain knowledge to advanced initiates. But one specific category of prohibition stands apart from the general pattern of graduated esoteric restriction, and it appears with unusual consistency across training texts from Nippur and Babylon. This category prohibits not the transmission of knowledge to uninitiated students, but the oral performance of specific text classes by anyone, regardless of initiation level. The prohibition is absolute. Tablet CBS 12649 from the University of Pennsylvania collection, a scribal training text dated to approximately 1800 years before the Common Era, states explicitly that certain names from the elder composition are to be copied in written form for the preservation of knowledge, but are not to enter the mouth of any scribe, novice, or master, under penalty of divine displeasure of a kind that cannot be remedied by any known ritual of purification. The institutional consistency of this prohibition across independent scribal traditions suggests it derived from a genuine theological conviction rather than bureaucratic convention. Tablet CB S12649 is remarkable not only for the explicitness of its prohibition, but for the context in which that prohibition appears. The tablet is not a specialized ritual text or a restricted theological treatise. It is a standard scribal training document of the type that Aduba schoolchildren copied as part of their basic instruction in writing conventions and professional conduct. Its content covers proper tablet preparation, ink composition, the etiquette of approaching senior scribes for guidance, and the acceptable uses of different categories of writing surface. The prohibition on voicing the elder composition names appears embedded within this mundane professional curriculum without special introduction or extended explanation, as if it were so thoroughly normalized that its inclusion among instructions about tablet preparation required no more justification than those instructions did. A beginning scribe at the Eduba school in Nippur around 1800 years before the Common Era apparently learned that you do not speak the names of the elder composition in the same educational context in which you learned how to wet clay to the correct consistency for inscription. The prohibition was not an advanced theological refinement reserved for senior practitioners. It was basic professional knowledge transmitted from the first weeks of scribal training. Additional training texts from catalogued in the British Museum as B 86372 and Bean 86373 and published by Nick Veldhuis of the University of California at Berkeley in a 2014 analysis of scribal school material, contain parallel prohibition language employing different but functionally identical Akkadian phraseology. The texts do not reference the elder composition by the same Sumerian designation used in CBS 12649, but they prohibit the same category of oral performance using the same absolute terms and the same characterization of the consequences as irremediable through ritual means. The irremediability of the consequences specified in these training texts represents a theologically significant detail that distinguishes the silence protocol prohibition from every other category of ritual restriction in the Mesopotamian sacred literature. Standard Mesopotamian theology provided extensive ritual remediation systems for virtually every category of religious transgression. Namburbi rituals could avert the evil portended by inauspicious omens. Shwila prayers could address divine displeasure caused by inadvertent violations of sacred protocol. Maklu incantation series could counter the effects of witchcraft and magical pollution. The theological framework of Mesopotamian religious practice was comprehensive, precisely because it assumed that transgressions would occur and provided systematic means of addressing them. The prohibition on voicing the elder composition names was categorically excluded from this remediation framework. No Namburbi ritual addressed the consequence. No Shwila prayer could repair the damage. The divine displeasure generated by oral recitation of the pre-divine names was, uniquely in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian ritual literature, permanent and beyond institutional remedy. The question this exclusion raises is not merely theological but cosmological. What was believed to happen when those names were spoken aloud that made the consequence categorically different from every other form of ritual transgression? The CBS fragment's description of the transmission process from the pre-divine entities to the Anunnaki Council begins to provide an answer that the training text's prohibition was apparently designed institutionally to prevent anyone from testing. The transmission process described in the CBS 19838 fragments is the most theologically consequential element of the entire pre-divine tradition, because it directly addresses the origin and nature of Anunnaki power. The Sumerian creation narratives preserved in the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, and the series of compositions collected under the heading of Enki and World Order, describe the Anunnaki as possessing specific capabilities and forms of authority that they exercise by right of their divine nature. The ability to set destinies, to govern natural forces, to create and modify living beings, and to move between celestial and terrestrial domains, are treated in these compositions as innate characteristics of Anunnaki identity. Conventional scholarship understands these capabilities as divine attributes in a theological sense, properties that distinguish gods from humans in the Sumerian worldview. But the CBS 19838 fragments from Nippur, read in conjunction with parallel material from the AO 6317 tablets at the Louvre, suggest a different interpretive framework. The archaic Nippur text describes the transmission of specific functional properties from the predivine entities to a subsequent generation of beings in language that is unmistakably procedural rather than theological. The text does not describe a divine birth or a cosmological creation event. It describes what appears to be a deliberate transfer of properties, using administrative vocabulary almost identical to the language employed in later Sumerian texts to describe the transfer of the me, the divine decrees that govern civilizational order. The implication embedded in this archaic cosmological record is that the Anunnaki did not originate their defining capabilities independently. They received them through a transmission process from entities whose nature and origin the silence protocol was specifically designed to prevent anyone from investigating further. The specific functional properties described in the CBS transmission passage correspond, with a precision that resists coincidence, to the canonical list of Anunnaki capabilities preserved in the later Sumerian literary tradition. The ability to fix destinies, Namtar in Sumerian, appears in the CBS text as a transferred property, not a constitutive one, something given to the receiving entities rather than inherent in their nature. The ability to set cosmic order, Migal-E, appears in the same construction. The ability to create living beings from clay, a capability the Atrahasis epic presents as an Anunnaki innovation developed under Enki's direction, in response to the lesser god's labor rebellion, appears in the CBS fragments as a transferred capability, whose original form in the pre-divine entities differed in some unspecified way from the form in which the Anunnaki subsequently exercised it. The transmission passage employs a compound verb form that Bent Alster's 2005 analysis identified as appearing in three contexts in Old Babylonian Sumerian literature: the transfer of the me between divine beings, the transfer of royal authority between dynasties, and the transfer of craft knowledge between a master craftsman and an apprentice. In the CBS context, the verb designates a transfer of a property whose nature is partly preserved and partly transformed by the transmission process, what Alster rendered as a likeness transfer rather than a direct copy, meaning the receiving entities acquired a functional analogue of the pre-divine capability rather than the capability in its original form. The Anunnaki's power to set destinies was, on this reading, a derived and imperfectly reproduced version of whatever the pre-divine entities did when they performed the analogous function. The silence protocol protected this knowledge not merely because it was theologically inconvenient, but because a cosmological framework in which Anunnaki authority was understood as derived and imperfectly reproduced rather than absolute and self-originated would have implications for every institution in Mesopotamia that drew its legitimacy from Anunnaki sanction. The tradition that Anunnaki capabilities were received rather than inherent finds its most striking external confirmation not in any other Mesopotamian source, but in the systematic consistency with which ancient traditions worldwide position their divine hierarchies as secondary rather than primary within the total structure of existence. The presence of a cosmological stratum that precedes the divine in ancient Mesopotamian texts would represent a significant discovery in isolation. But the CBS 19838 fragments do not stand alone in suggesting that ancient traditions worldwide preserved awareness of a pre-divine level of existence. The Hindu cosmological concept of the Brahman, the impersonal absolute that precedes and subsumes all divine manifestation, appears in the Upanishads as a reminder that the gods themselves, including the great Trimurti of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, are expressions of a more fundamental reality that exists before and after any divine configuration. The Rig Veda's Nasadya Sukta, the famous creation hymn sometimes translated as the hymn of non-existence, opens with a description of a primordial state in which not existence nor non-existence existed, in which the gods themselves had not yet come to be. The Egyptian Heliopolitan cosmology begins not with Atum, the creator god, but with the Nun, a primordial void described in terms closely parallel to the archaic Nippur fragments, an undifferentiated state of potential that preceded divine emergence rather than containing it. Hesiod's theogony, the Greek synthesis of earlier cosmological traditions, opens not with Zeus or the Olympians, but with chaos, a pre-divine condition from which the first cosmic entities emerged, and the Norse cosmological sequence preserved in the prose Edda begins with Ginnungagap, the void that preceded the existence of even the primordial giant Ymir from whom the gods fashioned the world. The consistent appearance across independent traditions of a pre-divine cosmological layer, frequently characterized by silence, darkness, formlessness, or prohibition, suggests these independent traditions may be preserving a genuine ancient memory of something that human civilization once understood and then, systematically, chose to stop naming aloud. The depth and specificity of these parallel traditions extends considerably beyond the broad thematic convergence of their opening cosmological positions. The Upanishadic description of Brahman employs language that has attracted the sustained analytical attention of comparative mythologists precisely because of how specifically it corresponds to the CBS fragment's characterization of the pre-divine entities. The Chandogya Upanishad, one of the oldest of the Upanishadic texts and dated to approximately 800 years before the Common Era, describes the pre-divine absolute as Sat, the simply existent, characterized above all by the absence of any attribute or quality that could serve as the basis for the act of naming. It cannot be described as this or as that, the text states, because all descriptive predicates apply to the differentiated realm that emerge from it rather than to it itself. This is precisely the logical structure that the Silence Protocol's distinction between written preservation and oral prohibition instantiates. The pre-divine entities of the CBS fragments can be designated in writing, using archaic terms that preserve the phonological record of their names, but their oral invocation would constitute a category error of a cosmological magnitude, an attempt to activate through the speech act of naming an order of reality, for which the act of naming is structurally inappropriate. The Egyptian nun presents a similarly specific parallel. The pyramid text utterance 527 describes the nun not as a void of emptiness, but as a plenum of potentiality, a condition described using the Egyptian term hehu, meaning the millions or the uncountable, suggesting not absence but an excess of undifferentiated presence that preceded the first differentiation. The Taoist concept of the Tao, articulated in the Tao Te Ching attributed to Laozi and dated by scholarly consensus to approximately the 4th century before the Common Era, but drawing on earlier Chinese cosmological traditions, employs the phrase Wu Ming, the nameless, to describe the state prior to the division of existence into the differentiated categories that language and naming presuppose. The first line of the Tao Te Ching declares that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, a formulation whose structural logic mirrors the Silence Protocol's distinction between the writable and the speakable, with a precision that independent cultural development cannot adequately account for. Whether the worldwide consistency of this pre-divine cosmological structure reflects a common origin in an ancient shared tradition, a universal feature of human cosmological thinking confronting the limits of language, or some combination of both possibilities, the evidence demands a more rigorous answer than the conventional framework of independent cultural development has provided. The CBS fragments, the Kalam Tablets, the phonological anomalies of the entity names, and the worldwide pattern of pre-divine silence that these traditions uniformly observe, collectively constitute a body of evidence pointing toward a knowledge system that was once more widely shared, more systematically maintained, and more institutionally protected than anything in the conventional history of ancient religion has been prepared to acknowledge. Recognizing the full scope of what was being protected requires returning to the physical record with a precision that the textual analysis developed across the preceding evidence makes possible for the first time. The worldwide pattern of pre-divine silence documented across Mesopotamian, Indian, Egyptian, Greek, Norse, and Chinese traditions establishes the conceptual framework. What the ground at Eridu preserves is the spatial and material expression of that framework at its oldest documented location. The archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted by Fuad Safar and Muhammad Ali Mustafa between 1946 and 1949, produce stratigraphic evidence that has shaped Mesopotamian archaeology for 3/4 of a century. The site's 17 temple levels, each built directly upon the ruins of the previous structure in a continuous tradition of sacred reconstruction that spanned more than 4,000 years, represent the longest documented sequence of religious continuity at any excavated site in the ancient world. What the excavation reports document, but what has received less analytical attention than the architectural sequence itself, is the pattern of object deposits found in the 3 deepest building levels, those corresponding to what the excavators designated as Eridu periods 1 through 3 and dated to approximately 5,500 through 5,200 years before the Common Era. These deposits, described in the field notes now preserved in the Iraqi Department of Antiquities archive and in published form in Safar and Lloyd's 1981 final site report, included concentrations of deliberately deposited clay objects in locations that did not correspond to standard altar or offering configurations. The objects bore incised marks. Some were deposited facing downward in a manner that the excavators noted as unusual, but did not interpret further. The distribution pattern of these downward-facing marked objects, when mapped across the 3 earliest building levels, traces a spatial arrangement that corresponds to a 7-point configuration, 7 locations, 7 marked objects, 7 positions distributed through the sacred space of what may be the world's oldest continuously occupied religious site. The number that appears in every pre-divine reference across the Nippur fragments, the Kalam Tablets, and the archaic Eridu notation sequences. The downward-facing orientation of the marked objects deserves analytical attention that the original excavation report declined to provide. In the standard Mesopotamian offering deposit tradition, objects placed as votive deposits are oriented toward the deity they address, facing upward toward the celestial realm, facing inward toward the sacred space of the temple interior, or positioned in relation to the statue or altar that served as the deity's focal point within the building. The downward-facing orientation documented by Safar in the Eridu period 1 through 3 deposits inverts this convention. It positions the incised marks not toward a divine presence above or within the sacred space, but toward the ground beneath, toward the earth in which the objects were being embedded. The most coherent interpretation of this inversion, read against the pre-divine tradition of the CBS fragments, is that the objects were oriented not toward any being inhabiting the celestial or terrestrial realm, but toward whatever the tradition understood to occupy a cosmological position below or prior to those realms. The pre-divine entities whose spatial designation, as the astronomical analysis of the CBS entity name suggested, lay outside all three celestial pathways of the observable sky. Bearing marked objects face down in the foundational earth of the world's oldest temple, positioned in a 7-point geometric configuration, represents in physical terms exactly what the CBS fragments represent in textual terms, a preserved record of the pre-divine entities that acknowledges their existence without performing the oral activation that the silence protocol categorically prohibited. The incised marks on the Eridu objects provide the link between this physical deposit tradition and the written record at Nippur. Safa's field notes, examined in detail by Jean-Jacques Gleisner during his 2003 analysis of archaic sign traditions for the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris, recorded that the marks on the downward-facing objects at Eridu did not correspond to the standard pictographic signs of the proto-cuneiform writing system that appears in the Uruk IV stratum tablets from roughly the same period. They corresponded instead to a smaller subset of sign forms that Gleisner had independently identified in his survey of the Uruk IV compositional tablets as the anomalous clusters representing the pre-divine entity designations. The same marks that appeared on tablets in the British Museum, the Berlin collections and the Iraq Museum as designations without institutional referent in any known human or divine classification system were being embedded face down in the foundation earth of Eridu's earliest temples. The written sign and the physical deposit were expressions of the same tradition, calibrated to the same cosmological framework, employing the same 7-point configuration, and observed at the same institutional location. Eridu was not simply the world's oldest city in the Sumerian literary tradition. It was the site at which the pre-divine tradition was first architecturally and materially encoded, the place where the knowledge of what came before the beginning was first translated from whatever form it originally took into the clay and geometry of human ritual practice. The cosmological understanding that generated this ritual practice was not, on the evidence of the CBS vocabulary, a naive or primitive one. Its technical sophistication becomes apparent when the linguistic analysis is pursued beyond the level of divine nomenclature and into the deeper structure of how the pre-divine condition itself was characterized. The ancient Mesopotamian concept of chaos has generally been understood by scholarship as a theological construct, a mythological representation of disorder, that the divine creative act transforms into cosmic order. The primordial Tiamat of the Enuma Elish, the undifferentiated waters of the Eridu Genesis, and the darkness before Anunnaki separated are conventionally interpreted as symbolic expressions of a worldview that values divine order over primordial chaos. But when the technical vocabulary of the CBS 19838 fragments is subjected to linguistic analysis, a different reading becomes possible. Assyriologist and computational linguist Gabor Zolyomi of the Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, working on related archaic Sumerian grammatical structures in 2012, identified in his published analysis of pre-canonical Sumerian syntax a set of nominal forms that do not describe states of disorder, but rather states of compressed potential, conditions characterized not by randomness, but by an extraordinary density of unmanifested structure. Applied to the pre-divine terminology of the Nippur fragments, this grammatical analysis suggests that the entities designated by the silence protocol were understood not as chaotic forces threatening divine order, but as reservoirs of structured potential from which divine order itself was drawn, at a cost that the text implies but declines to specify. The cosmological physics suggested by this reading is not one of divine victory over chaos. It is one of divine emergence from a prior order of such concentrated complexity that to name it directly was believed to risk invoking a structural condition that the existing cosmic arrangement could not sustain. Zolyomi's 2012 monograph, published in the series Mesopotamian Civilizations by Eisenbrauns under the title Nominal Morphology in Archaic Sumerian, identifies the specific nominal forms in question as a class he designates as compressed state nominals, a grammatical construction in which a nominal head takes a set of modifiers that collectively describe not the properties of an entity, but the properties of the condition from which that entity's existence is not distinguished. The distinction is subtle, but consequential. A standard Sumerian nominal construction describes an entity and its attributes. A compressed state nominal describes a condition in which the distinction between entity and attribute has not yet been established. The predivine terms in the CBS fragments are grammatically structured as compressed state nominals, meaning that the entities they designate are not being described as things with properties, but as conditions from which the distinction between things and properties has not yet emerged. The 7 pre-divine entities of the CBS fragments were not, on this grammatical reading, 7 beings with different characteristics. They were 7 compressed states of existence from which the differentiated cosmos, including its division into entities and their attributes, had been drawn. The Anunnaki's capabilities were not copies of the pre-divine capabilities, but differentiations extracted from pre-divine conditions that were themselves undifferentiated. This is the cosmological physics encoded in the Silence Protocol's categorical distinction between writing and speaking. To write the names preserved the record of what the undifferentiated conditions had been. To speak them would risk reinstantiating the undifferentiated condition itself within a cosmos that had organized itself around differentiation. The institutional stakes of that risk were everything the Mesopotamian priestly establishment existed to protect. The effort to eliminate the textual record of those conditions was correspondingly comprehensive. The pattern of deliberate tablet destruction identified above the CBS 19838 layer at Nippur does not represent an isolated event. Comparative archaeological evidence from multiple Mesopotamian sites reveals what appears to be a coordinated campaign of specific textual erasure that occurred across a relatively narrow time window corresponding to the transition from the late Uruk to the early Jemdet Nasta period, approximately 3,100 to 2,900 years before the Common Era. At Uruk, the German Oriental Society's excavations of the Anu Ziggurat area, conducted by Julius Jordan between 1912 and 1913, and resumed by Heinrich Lenzen in the 1950s, produced evidence of a destruction deposit in the Iana precinct that contained the broken remains of a specific tablet format. The tablets in question, identified by their clay composition and the distinctive rectangular format used for early literary rather than administrative compositions, had been broken into fragments averaging less than 3 centimeters in maximum dimension, a degree of fragmentation that the excavators noted was inconsistent with construction fill, but consistent with deliberate pulverization. Similar deposits of systematically fragmented literary format tablets from the same general time period have been documented at by Leonard Woolley's expedition, at Kish by the Field Museum and Oxford University joint expedition of the 1920s, and at Shurupak by Robert Koldewe's earlier excavations. In each case, the destroyed tablets were of the pre-standard literary format, associated with the archaic script tradition that produced the CBS 19838 fragments. The scope and synchrony of this destruction pattern suggests not individual acts of political erasure, but a coordinated institutional decision to eliminate a specific body of knowledge at a specific moment in Mesopotamian history. The clay composition analysis that allowed archaeologists to identify the destroyed tablets as belonging to the pre-standard literary format reveals an additional dimension of the erasure campaign's targeting precision. Neutron activation analysis of clay fragments from the Uruk destruction deposit, conducted by a team from the Max Planck Institute for Nuclear Physics in Heidelberg in collaboration with the German Oriental Society, and published in the journal Archaeometry in 1997, found that the mineral composition of the destroyed fragments corresponded to clay sources in the alluvial plain south of Uruk, rather than to the local Uruk clay used for the administrative tablets produced at the site during the same period. The destroyed tablets had been brought to Uruk from elsewhere, or had been produced at Uruk using clay transported from the southern delta region where Eridu was located. This finding implies that the destroyed literary format tablets were not locally produced documents of Uruk's own institutional record. They were materials whose clay sourcing connected them to the Eridu tradition, the tradition that the Eridu period 1 through 3 deposits, the incised downward-facing objects, and the archaic astronomical alignments of the earliest temple levels all pointed toward. The erasure campaign at Uruk was not destroying Uruk's own records. It was destroying copies or extensions of the Eridu pre-divine tradition that had been distributed to Uruk and were being eliminated from that site. The distribution of the material and the coordination of its elimination collectively established that the pre-divine tradition had spread beyond Eridu before the erasure campaign was mounted, and that the campaign was organized with sufficient institutional reach to address that distribution simultaneously across multiple major sites. What the erasure campaign could not reach were the words themselves, embedded in the living structure of the Sumerian language, preserved in semantic forms whose surface meanings had drifted far enough from their original context to escape detection by the institutional apparatus conducting the suppression. Languages preserve the history of the peoples who spoke them in ways that deliberate erasure campaigns cannot fully control. Individual words, grammatical forms, and phonological patterns can survive the destruction of the texts they originally appeared in, embedded in later compositions as relics, whose original context has been severed, but whose linguistic substance remains. The Sumerian lexicon contains a number of terms whose semantic range and phonological composition suggest they were originally associated with the pre-divine tradition, represented in the CBS 19838 fragments. Terms that survived because their surface meanings were innocuous enough that later compilers retained them without recognizing their deeper cosmological implications. The Sumerian term Anzag, usually translated as pure or holy in the context of temple rituals and divine attributes, carries in its archaic usage a connotation of boundary or limit, specifically the limit at which a more fundamental order gives way to a less fundamental one. In the pre-divine context suggested by the Nippur fragments, this term appears to designate the interface between the pre-divine condition and the realm in which the Anunnaki operated. Its survival as a generic term for sacred purity represents a semantic drift that preserved the phonological fossil while stripping it of its original cosmological precision. Assyriologist Jeremy Black of Oxford University, in his 2004 collaborative dictionary project on archaic Sumerian semantics, identified 17 similar terms whose archaic semantic fields clustered around boundary, threshold, and transition concepts inconsistent with their classical meanings, but entirely consistent with a cosmological vocabulary for describing the emergence of divine order from a pre-divine substrate. These linguistic fossils represent fragments of the tradition the Silence Protocol was designed to suppress, surviving not because they evaded the erasure campaign, but because they were not recognized as evidence of what was being erased. Black 17 terms, identified through a computational analysis of the Sumerian lexical corpus that compared archaic and classical usages systematically across the full range of texts then available in the Pen-Sumerian dictionary database, represent a conservative identification of the fossil set. His methodology required a demonstrable semantic shift between the archaic and classical usages, documented by at least 2 independent textual examples from different sites, a standard that limited his identification to cases where the evidence was unambiguous. The full fossil set is likely considerably larger. Among the 17 terms Black identified, 4 deserve particular attention for the specificity with which their archaic usages map onto the pre-divine cosmological framework of the CBS fragments. The term Abgal, usually translated as sage or wise one in the standard literary period where it designates the Apkallu advisors to the antediluvian kings, carries in its archaic Nippur usage a connotation not of wisdom as a personal attribute, but of wisdom as a structural property of a specific cosmological position, wisdom understood as the condition of standing at the boundary between the undifferentiated and the differentiated. The term Gisu, usually translated as shadow or shade in its classical usage, where it designates protective divine presence, appears in archaic contexts at Eridu in a construction that suggests not shadow as the absence of light, but shadow as the zone immediately adjacent to a source of concentrated presence, the region at the boundary of an intensity too great for direct engagement. The term Engur, the archaic designator of the underground freshwater realm that later Sumerian standardized as the Apsu, appears in 3 archaic Nippur texts, in contexts suggesting not a physical body of water, but a condition of structural depth, a stratum of existence whose defining characteristic was that it lay beneath everything else rather than alongside it. And the term Mi itself, the divine decrees that governed civilizational order in the standard Sumerian cosmological framework, appears in the CBS fragments transmission passage, using an archaic compound form that designates not the decrees as a category of divine instrument, but the specific subset of decrees transferred from the pre-divine entities to the Anunnaki, a subset whose designation implies they were not the complete set of what the pre-divine tradition maintained, but a derivative portion extracted for the purpose of enabling the differentiated cosmos to operate according to structural principles whose full complexity remained encoded in the undifferentiated source from which they were drawn. The geographical distance between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the chronological depth at which both traditions converge on the same pre-divine cosmological structure, establishes that what the linguistic fossils in Sumerian preserve as semantic residue, the Egyptian tradition preserved in active and elaborated form within its oldest surviving religious literature. The textual tradition of ancient Egypt, despite its geographical and cultural separation from Mesopotamia, preserves a cosmological stratum that mirrors the pre-divine layer evidenced in the CBS 19838 fragments with a precision that demands explanation. The pyramid texts, the oldest body of religious literature yet discovered, inscribed on the walls of the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs between approximately 2,400 and 2,200 years before the Common Era, begin not with the creative act of Atum, but with a description of a condition that preceded even Atum's emergence. The The standard translation of utterance 527 from the Pyramid of Unas reads as describing a time when the sky had not yet come into being, when the earth had not yet come into being, when men had not yet come into being, when the gods had not yet been born. The gods in this pre-creation state had not yet come into being, the divine had not yet emerged. What existed before divine emergence is described in the same utterance using Egyptian terminology that bears a phonological and semantic correspondence to the archaic Sumerian terms in the Nippur fragments, remarkable enough to have prompted Egyptologist Jan Assmann of the University of Konstanz to note in his 2001 study, Moses the Egyptian, an apparent shared cosmological vocabulary between the earliest Egyptian and Mesopotamian religious traditions that could not be satisfactorily explained by known channels of cultural contact. The inference Assmann drew carefully, and that the evidence increasingly supports, is that both traditions were drawing on a common older cosmological framework whose origins preceded the separate development of Egyptian and Sumerian civilization. Assmann's observation about the shared cosmological vocabulary was precise in its identification of the specific Egyptian and Sumerian terms that converge, and cautious in its refusal to speculate beyond what the linguistic evidence warranted. The terms he identified as showing unexplained cross-cultural correspondence included the Egyptian Enuma designating the primordial ocean, whose phonological form parallels the archaic Sumerian Engur in a manner that the known channels of Egyptian Mesopotamian contact during the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods cannot account for. The correspondence is not one of borrowing in either direction, but of parallel preservation of an older phonological form that appears to have existed in a proto-tradition, from which both the archaic Sumerian and the pre-dynastic Egyptian cosmological vocabularies derived their basic terms. The Hermopolitan Ogdoad, the 8 primordial entities of the alternative Egyptian creation tradition, associated with the city of Hermopolis, rather than the better-known Heliopolitan or Memphite systems, provides the most structurally precise Egyptian parallel for the pre-divine tradition of the CBS fragments. The Ogdoad consists of 4 male-female pairs of primordial entities designated by names meaning the watery abyss, the void or invisibility, the darkness, and the hidden. These 4 pairs, totaling 8 entities, embody conditions of existence that preceded divine creation in a manner structurally identical to the CBS fragments' 7 compressed state nominals, not beings with attributes, but conditions from which the distinction between beings and attributes had not yet been extracted. The difference in number between the CBS tradition's 7 and the Hermopolitan tradition's 8 may reflect local adaptations of a shared proto-tradition, rather than a fundamental structural difference between the 2 cosmological frameworks. What is consistent across both is the designation of a pre-divine stratum characterized by compression, potential, and the absence of the differentiations that divine and human existence alike depend upon, and the preservation of that stratum in forms that could be written, depicted, and architecturally encoded without being spoken into active presence. The Egyptian tradition encoded this understanding in the walls of pharaonic burial chambers and the ritual texts of temple liturgy. The Sumerian tradition encoded it in the clay deposits of Eridu's foundation and the sealed archives of Nippur's Ika precinct. The medium differed. The knowledge being preserved was, at its structural core, the same. That the same fundamental knowledge found expression in such different media across such different traditions invites a question that goes to the heart of what the silence protocol actually was, not why it existed, which the cosmological analysis of Zoliomi's compressed state nominals and the astronomical analysis of the pre-divine entity name coordinates have begun to explain, but why it took the specific institutional form it did, prohibiting speech while explicitly mandating written preservation. The apparent paradox at the center of this investigation is the silence protocol itself. If the pre-divine entity names and their associated cosmological narrative were considered so dangerous that their oral recitation was categorically prohibited, why were they preserved in written form at all? Why did the priests responsible for maintaining Mesopotamian temple archives choose to record, copy, and apparently transmit across generations a body of knowledge whose spoken expression they had classified as a theological violation of the highest order? The answer, embedded in the temple administrative texts and in the broader Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between written and spoken language, reveals a philosophical sophistication that challenges modern assumptions about ancient literacy. In Sumerian theological understanding, the spoken word and the written sign were not equivalent representations of the same underlying meaning. They were categorically different acts with categorically different consequences. The spoken word in Sumerian cosmological theory participated in the reality it named. This is the theoretical foundation of the Sumerian concept of the me, the divine decrees, which were not merely descriptions of civilizational functions, but active participants in the maintenance of those functions. To speak a name was to invoke the reality it designated. To write a name was to preserve information about that reality without activating it. The silence protocol therefore represents not suppression in the modern sense, but a sophisticated information management strategy. The pre-divine entities and their names were preserved in clay, precisely because the knowledge was considered too important to lose. They were forbidden from oral recitation, precisely because the knowledge was considered too dangerous to activate. Written clay was the only medium that could contain what the tradition needed to remember, without risk of what the tradition feared to invoke. The theoretical framework underlying this distinction between written preservation and oral activation is documented in a body of Mesopotamian texts that have received less systematic attention than the literary and mythological compositions they philosophically underpin. The tablet series known as the Examination of the Scribal Art, catalogued across multiple museum collections, but most completely preserved in the British Museum holdings as BM 36719 through BM 36724, and published in critical edition by Nick Veldhuis in 2014, describes the relationship between the written sign and the spoken word in terms that make the silence protocol's logic explicit. The texts establish a hierarchy of semiotic modes in which the written sign at the most fundamental level contains what the text terms the sleeping form of meaning, an encoded potential that exists in a stable and inert state within the clay. The spoken word activates this sleeping form, drawing it from potential into participation in the differentiated reality of lived existence. The ritual texts associated with divine name invocation in Mesopotamian temple liturgy reflect this understanding in their prescribed procedures. A divine name spoken correctly and in proper ritual context was believed to summon the presence of the deity it designated, not as a symbolic gesture toward an absent divine being, but as an actual activation of the divine reality the name encoded. The ritual manuals for divine name invocation, preserved in the Maklu and Shurpu incantation series, specify pitch, duration, and phonological precision for spoken divine names, because each of these parameters affected the nature and degree of activation the speech act produced. The silence protocol applied this same theoretical framework to the pre-divine entity names with a single but consequential modification. where standard divine name invocation was a controlled and ritually managed activation. The oral performance of the pre-divine names was assessed as producing an activation that no ritual management protocol could control or contain. The sleeping form of what those names encoded was not, apparently, the kind of reality that the differentiated cosmos of Anunnaki governance could safely accommodate in its activated state. The sophistication of this distinction between encoded potential and activated reality anticipates discussions in contemporary philosophy of language and semiotics concerning the difference between the representational and the performative functions of linguistic signs. John Austin's 1962 lectures on speech act theory, published posthumously as How to Do Things with Words, established within modern linguistics the distinction between constative utterances that describe states of affairs and performative utterances that enact states of affairs through the act of speaking. The Mesopotamian temple tradition had codified an equivalent distinction approximately 3,000 years earlier, applied with cosmological rather than merely linguistic precision, and had used it to design an archival system whose formal structure embodied the theory it was built to implement. The written signs on the CBS 19838 tablets were constative in Austin's sense. They described the pre-divine entities and their conditions of existence without enacting those conditions. The spoken word would have been performative in a cosmological sense, whose consequences the silence protocol treated as beyond institutional management. The priestly architects of this system understood the difference between preserving a description and invoking a reality with a precision that the modern philosophical vocabulary for this distinction was developed only in the middle of the 20th century to articulate. What those same priestly architects understood about the temporal scale at which the pre-divine entities had operated places the entire history of the Anunnaki Council, and by extension the entire span of recorded human civilization, in a chronological perspective that the Sumerian king list already extraordinary antediluvian chronology only hints at. The Sumerian king list pre-flood chronology, with its 8 antediluvian rulers credited with combined reigns of 241,200 years, has long challenged scholars who must choose between dismissing these figures as mythological invention and attempting to explain them within a framework of actual historical measurement. The mathematical precision of these figures, all exact multiples of the Sumerian unit called the Sar equal to 3,600 years, argues against random invention and toward deliberate astronomical calculation. But the CBS 19838 fragments from Nippur introduce a chronological scale that makes even the antediluvian king list look recent. The pre-divine entities named in the archaic text are associated with time periods designated using a numerical unit that does not appear in the standard Sumerian mathematical lexicon. The unit, rendered in the archaic script using a sign combination that Thorkild Jacobsen, in his 1973 analysis, tentatively identified as a compound of the signs for great, cycle, and before, appears to designate a temporal period of a magnitude that the standard Sumerian base 60 numerical system would have expressed as a multiple of the Sar far exceeding the antediluvian chronology. Comparative analysis with the Hindu cosmological timeframes preserved in the Puranas, where the universe undergoes creation and dissolution across periods measured in billions of years, corresponding to specific astronomical cycles, suggest that the pre-divine temporal scale encoded in the Nippur fragments may represent a genuine cosmological framework for measuring time at the scale of galactic rather than planetary cycles, a framework whose mathematical basis, the silence protocol, may have been designed to prevent from entering the philosophical conversation of ancient Mesopotamia precisely because its implications for the relative novelty of the Anunnaki's cosmic authority were too destabilizing to permit. Jakobsen's identification of the CBS temporal unit as a compound of signs for great, cycle, and before, though explicitly tentative in his 1973 typescript, has since been partly corroborated by the archaic sign analysis conducted by Hans Nissen of the Free University of Berlin in his comprehensive study of late Uruk period sign development. Nissen's work, published in English translation as Archaic Bookkeeping in 1993, and extended in his 2001 survey of the proto-cuneiform sign corpus, documented that the sign combination Jakobsen identified as the CBS temporal unit appeared in 3 other archaic contexts from the Uruk IV stratum, in each case designating a duration or cycle whose magnitude was expressed through the compound rather than through the standard numerical notation system that governed the base 60 administrative calculations of the period. The compound's appearance outside the standard numerical notation system implies that whatever temporal magnitude it designated fell outside the range that the standard system was designed to represent. The largest unit in the standard Sumerian base 60 system that appears in the antediluvian king list is the Sa of 3,600 years. The CBS temporal unit, expressed through a compound that operated outside the standard numerical notation, designated something categorically larger than the Sa rather than merely a larger multiple of it. When Kramer compared this structure with the Hindu Kalpa, the cosmic time unit of the Puranas corresponding to 4.32 billion years, and divided into smaller cycles including the Manvantara of approximately 306 million years and the Mahayuga of 4,320,000 years, the mathematical relationships between these Hindu units and the astronomical cycles they track through precession, galactic orbital mechanics, and solar system dynamics suggested that the CBS temporal unit and its Hindu cosmological equivalents were both expressions of a framework for measuring time at astronomical scales that the Sumerian base 60 system was not designed to address. If the pre-divine entities were associated with temporal periods of this magnitude, the Anunnaki Council, whose authority the antediluvian king list situates within a span of 241,200 years, occupied a cosmological moment of extraordinary recentness within the pre-divine tradition's time frame. The institutional stakes of this perspective for every authority structure in Mesopotamian civilization that derived its legitimacy from Anunnaki sanction explain the comprehensiveness of the Silence Protocol with a clarity that no other interpretive framework provides. The Babylonian scholars who inherited the Silence Protocol and its associated archival and initiatic traditions did not simply maintain a prohibition they no longer understood. They encoded the tradition's essential structure into the official cosmological literature precisely so that those with the appropriate preparation could continue to read it. The systematic destruction of the early tablet series and the institutional silence protocol covering the pre-divine entity names did not eliminate the tradition they protected. It drove it underground into the symbolic and structural architecture of the official cosmological literature that survived. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic whose composition is generally dated to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, contains structural anomalies that become intelligible only when read against the pre-divine framework of the Nippur fragments. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish describe the condition before creation, using the Akkadian terms Enuma Elish, when above, and Shaplitu, when below, a grammatical construction that describes not a physical location, but a temporal condition before the differentiation of above and below was established. The text then introduces Apsu and Tiamat as the first named entities, the freshwater and saltwater primordial ocean pair. But the grammar of their introduction does not describe their creation. It describes their presence as pre-existing the naming event that the narrative records, using verb forms that scholars including Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem have noted in his 2011 study on Mesopotamian cosmic geography imply that Apsu and Tiamat already existed when the narrative begins. Something came before them that the text does not name. The Enuma Elish's silence at precisely the point where the Nippur fragment's forbidden nomenclature would be expected is not accidental omission. It is the architectural trace of the silence protocol, built into the structure of Mesopotamia's most authoritative cosmological composition, to signal to those who knew how to read it that the forbidden tradition had been acknowledged and then deliberately not spoken. Horowitz's 2011 analysis identified the grammatical anomaly in the Enuma Elish's opening lines through a comparative study of creation narrative verb forms across a corpus of Babylonian cosmological texts. The standard pattern for introducing primordial entities in Babylonian cosmological literature employs a verbal form that designates the act of coming into being, a perfective aspect that situates the entity's emergence at the narrative's cosmological starting point. The Enuma Elish's introduction of Apsu and Tiamat uses instead a stative form that designates an already established condition rather than an emergence event, as if the narrative opened not at the beginning, but at the moment when the narrator first turned attention to entities that had already been present for an unspecified prior duration. Horowitz noted this anomaly without connecting it to the pre-divine tradition of the CBS fragments, which remained outside his analytical framework. But the CBS material provides the explanation that the grammatical analysis on its own cannot supply. Apsu and Tiamat were introduced in stative form because the Enuma Elish was composed by scholars who understood from the initiatic curriculum that Apsu and Tiamat were not themselves the beginning, but secondary emergences from the pre-divine compressed state nominals that the silence protocol protected. The stative verb form encoded this understanding structurally, preserving for those with appropriate preparation the recognition that something prior had been deliberately omitted. The Eridu Genesis, the earlier Sumerian creation narrative from which the Enuma Elish's Babylonian synthesis partially derived, contains a parallel structural gap at the equivalent cosmological position. The moment before Namu is introduced as the primordial generative ocean carries a grammatical marker that designates temporal priority without specifying what occupied the prior temporal position. In both compositions, at the equivalent structural moment, the same architectural trace of the silence protocol appears, an acknowledgement of prior existence encoded in grammar, followed by a silence where the name of that prior existence would be expected. The tradition was too widely known among the scholarly class that produced these compositions to be entirely absent from them. It was present in the only form the silence protocol permitted, structurally encoded, grammatically preserved, and orally unspoken. The scholars who both produced and could read these encoded texts were products of an educational system whose uppermost tier was explicitly designed to maintain precisely this kind of dual competency, the ability to participate in the official cosmological tradition while understanding the pre-divine framework that the official tradition's structured silences preserved. The institutional silence protocol prohibited oral recitation of the pre-divine entity names, but it did not prevent their continued study, their preservation through copying, or the development of interpretive traditions that kept their cosmological implications alive within the restricted inner circles of Mesopotamian priestly education. The mystery school traditions that operated within the major temple complexes of Nippur, Babylon, and Eridu maintained educational streams whose existence is documented in administrative records, initiation sequence descriptions, and curriculum texts recovered from multiple excavation contexts. Tablet VAT 13579 in the collection of the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, examined by Assyriologist Werner Meyer in the 1980s, describes a 4-level initiation sequence for advanced temple scholars at Babylon, in which the first 3 levels correspond to the standard theological education documented elsewhere, and the 4th level, available only to those who had demonstrated decades of competence, and whose personal character had been formally assessed by the temple's senior scholars, involved exposure to what the text calls the elder writings in their written form. The text is careful to specify the written form, echoing the Silence Protocol's distinction between permissible written preservation and prohibited oral activation. The curriculum associated with this 4th level of initiation was apparently comprehensive enough to require its own dedicated instruction space within the temple complex, and the training it provided in mathematical, astronomical, and cosmological analysis evidently produced scholars whose capabilities exceeded those of their peers by measurable degrees. The Apkallu sages who served as royal advisors, whose wisdom traditions continued through the Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian periods, drew on this 4th-level curriculum, maintaining across the centuries a line of scholars who understood what the Silence Protocol protected, and who kept that understanding alive through precisely the channels the protocol had designated as permissible: written transmission within initiated circles, never oral recitation, never public disclosure. Mayer's analysis of VAT 13579, published in a 1987 article in the journal Orientalia, identified several features of the 4th-level curriculum description that distinguished it from the standard theological education documented in the Adaba training texts. The 4th level's instruction space was physically separated from the main scribble school complex, located in what the tablet describes as the house of the sealed knowledge within the inner precinct of the Babylon temple complex. Access to this space required a formal authorization process that the tablet describes, in procedural terms matching the authorization language used for the most restricted categories of temple archive access elsewhere in the Babylonian administrative record. The curriculum itself, as described in the tablet, was not a collection of additional text to be studied in addition to the standard canon. It was a set of reading instructions for the standard canon, a framework of interpretive keys that allowed the standard text to be read for the structural silences and grammatical traces that encoded the pre-divine tradition, rather than for their surface cosmological narratives. The 4th level did not add new knowledge to what the student already possessed. It transformed the relationship between the student and the knowledge the standard curriculum had already transmitted, revealing the pre-divine framework that the official tradition's architectural design had preserved. The scholars who emerged from this curriculum were not possessors of secret texts unavailable to their colleagues. They were readers of the same texts their colleagues read, but readers who understood what the structured silences within those texts preserved, and why the silence protocol that governed their handling was not a restriction on knowledge, but the specific form that the most important knowledge had taken in order to survive the erasure campaign that had attempted to eliminate it from the world. The survival of that knowledge across the full span of the evidence examined in this investigation argues for the existence of something more than institutional inertia or bureaucratic habit. The CBS 19838 fragments from Nippur, the A06317 tablets at the Louvre, the K1426 grouping at the British Museum, and the parallel material from Eridu's deepest excavation levels collectively constitute a body of evidence that the ancient Mesopotamian priestly tradition went to considerable effort both to preserve and to contain. The preservation effort manifested in careful copying across multiple generations, in the maintenance of underground archive facilities designed to protect the material through centuries of political upheaval, and in the establishment of initiatic educational streams that kept the interpretive tradition alive, argues against dismissing this body of knowledge as superstition or myth. The priestly institutions of ancient Mesopotamia were not naive. They were sophisticated administrators of some of the most complex bureaucratic and intellectual enterprises in the ancient world. When they chose to copy and preserve a text, they did so for reasons that their administrative culture understood as consequential. The question that the Silence Protocol forces is not whether the pre-divine cosmological tradition was real in some theological sense, but why the tradition's custodians considered it simultaneously too important to lose and too dangerous to speak. The answer that emerges from the accumulated evidence is one that challenges the most fundamental assumption of conventional ancient history: the assumption that the religious and cosmological systems of early civilizations represent primitive attempts to explain a world their creators did not yet understand. The evidence of the Nippur fragments, the Eridu deposits, the Kalam Tablets, and the priestly training texts that surrounded and protected them suggests instead that ancient Mesopotamian cosmology preserved within its deliberately constructed silence the outlines of a knowledge system whose full implications their most sophisticated scholars understood too well to speak aloud and too well to allow to be forgotten. What the underground archive facilities at Nippur, Eridu, Babylon and Uruk were specifically designed to protect extended well beyond the CBS fragments and their immediate companion material. The archive construction specifications documented in the temple administrative texts, with their precise requirements for sealed clay containers bearing no identifying inscriptions, their bitumen and mineral compound sealants calculated to preserve contents for durations measured in centuries, and their environmental control systems designed to maintain stable internal conditions without human maintenance, represent a level of institutional planning whose time horizon far exceeded the political calculations of any individual dynasty or priestly administration. The scholars who designed these systems were planning not for the next generation of initiates, but for the possibility that the initiatic tradition itself might be interrupted, that the living transmission chain might be broken, and that the knowledge would need to survive in its preserved written form long enough to be recovered by future scholars who might not know what they had found. The CBS fragment's survival through 8 decades of uncatalogued storage at the University of Pennsylvania, and their eventual examination by Thorkild Jacobsen in the winter of 1973, represents precisely the recovery scenario those archival systems were designed to make possible. The priests of ancient Nippur could not have known that their sealed containers would be excavated by a university expedition from Philadelphia in the 1890s, their contents photographed and transported across the Atlantic, and their significance recognized by a scholar working alone in a basement archive nearly a century after their recovery from the ground. But they built their preservation systems for exactly that kind of survival, and the system worked. The tablets endured. The knowledge they encoded endured within them. The question of what that knowledge ultimately means for our understanding of who the Anunnaki were, where they came from, and what preceded them in a cosmos whose age the CBS temporal unit measures on scales that dwarf everything human civilization has imagined itself to inhabit remains, as it was designed by those who preserved it to remain, an open question written in clay, waiting in silence for the voice that the Silence Protocol was specifically designed to ensure would never speak it. The silence that the ancient Mesopotamian priestly tradition constructed around the pre-divine entity names was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of precision, the deliberate restraint of a sophisticated institutional apparatus that understood exactly what it was protecting and exactly why the form of that protection had to take the specific shape it did. The evidence accumulated across this investigation points toward a conclusion that conventional ancient history has not been equipped to draw, not because the evidence was unavailable, but because the interpretive framework within which that evidence was processed was built on an assumption that the CBS fragments, the Eridu deposits, the Kalam Tablets, the phonological analysis of the entity names, the worldwide pattern of pre-divine cosmological traditions, and the institutional architecture of the Silence Protocol collectively dismantle. The assumption is that the religious and cosmological systems of the earliest human civilizations represented primitive engagements with a world that their creators were only beginning to understand. What the evidence suggests instead is that those systems represented the carefully managed remnants of an understanding already ancient when Sumer's earliest cities were built, an understanding of what preceded the differentiation of the cosmos into the ordered structure that the Anunnaki governed and that human civilization inhabited, preserved in clay and architecture and linguistic fossil and initiatic curriculum, precisely because those who maintained it understood that what it described was too consequential to lose and too structurally concentrated to safely invoke. The CBS 19838 fragments from Nippur did not survive 8 decades of uncatalogued storage and a century of institutional neglect by accident. They survived because the archival systems designed for their preservation were built by people who planned for exactly that kind of survival. People who understood that the knowledge encoded in the compressed state nominals of their archaic script might need to outlast not merely political transitions, but entire civilizational cycles. The 7 downward-facing objects in the foundation earth of Eridu's oldest temple, the anomalous stative verb forms at the opening of the Enuma Elish, the 17 linguistic fossils in the standard Sumerian lexicon, and the 4th-level curriculum of the Babylon initiatic sequence all represent different expressions of the same institutional commitment. The commitment to ensure that what the pre-divine tradition knew would remain available to whatever intelligence, in whatever future, arrived at the condition of being prepared to read it. For contemporary humanity, standing at a moment when the exponential acceleration of technological capability is once again outpacing the institutional wisdom available to manage it, the implications of that commitment are not merely academic. The Mesopotamian priestly tradition preserved a cosmological framework that situated human civilization and the divine authority that governed it within a temporal scale so vast and a structural hierarchy so deep that the entire span of recorded history occupied the position of a very recent and very secondary phenomenon within a cosmos whose prior organization was of a complexity that the differentiated world could not safely reactivate. Whether that framework encoded genuine ancient knowledge of cosmological realities that modern science is only beginning to approximate, or whether it represented the most sophisticated theological containment strategy that any human institution has ever designed, the question it forces on any serious engagement with the evidence is the same. What we have chosen not to speak, and what we have nonetheless chosen to preserve, may matter more than anything we have yet allowed ourselves to say aloud.